On June 13th, 1971, the New York Times published the first installment of a set of highly classified documents that changed the course of American history. Secretly copied by a military analyst named Daniel Ellsberg, they electrified readers with their revelations of how Washington had snookered Congress and the public into supporting the Vietnam War with billions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives. In the immediate aftermath, Ellsberg was arrested and charged under the Espionage Act. 2 years later, however, the government's proceedings against him fell apart and all charges were dismissed. Fast forward a half century, and the story of the Pentagon Papers, as they became known, is familiar to anyone who sat through a high school history or civics class. As for the man at its center, he spent the next 50 years resisting the powers that be as an anti-war activist and public intellectual. Diagnosed with inoperable pancreatic cancer in February of this year, Ellsberg died on June 16th. He was 92. Still, he was active as late as May, speaking with Politico about the dark history of American imperialism, the human cost of U.S. military interventions abroad, the ever-present danger of nuclear warfare, and the insanity, not to mention immorality, of threatening mass murder in the name of democracy or national security. It's from Freedom of the Press Foundation. We are heartbroken to learn that our dear friend Dan Ellsberg, world-renowned whistleblower and Freedom of the Press Foundation co-founder, has passed away. Dan Ellsberg stands as one of the most influential figures in American history, leaving an indelible impact on the last century. His courageous decision to leak the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times in 1971 led to the most important Supreme Court case for press freedom in the modern era, sparked a series of events that culminated in the resignation of President Richard Nixon, and ultimately accelerated the end of the Vietnam War. He became a hero to millions for his unwavering anti-war activism and decades-long fight to abolish nuclear weapons, but his long-term legacy may lie with the countless whistleblowers whom he inspired to follow in his footsteps. On that, I would agree. As a first source of a journalist to be prosecuted under the often abused Espionage Act, Ellsberg spent the second half of his life passionately defending other whistleblowers who were less fortunate than him. It's only because of what he would refer to as a series of miracles that he did not spend decades in prison himself. So he made it part of his mission to draw attention to the unjust and unconstitutional law and help the other patriotic whistleblowers who were irreparably harmed by it. Just to pause for a moment, I think that's a really important point if you want to understand Dan. I think I wouldn't say it was guilt, but he always felt like he should have had to sacrifice more, I believe. I think it's that. I believe that Dan's the kind of person who thought what he did, given the repressive acts of the government towards people today in the last 10 to 15 years, how did he get away with it? How did he manage to escape and not face that same punishment? The reason why we call Ellsberg the most dangerous man in America is because those were Henry Kissinger's words. I don't know if you all know that watching this, but those were Henry Kissinger's words. His words were that he was the most dangerous man in America. And not a lot made Henry Kissinger lose his cool, but what made Henry Kissinger livid was to see Daniel Ellsberg reveal this Pentagon Papers study. And let me just pull this up here for a moment here. You can find this. It's under Kissinger versus the most dangerous man in America. And so in his memoir, In Secrets, what I have right here, this book, he had a meeting with Kissinger. And in that meeting, here's something incredible that happened, which I'll just read to you. He met Kissinger because he had a friend who was an editor for this magazine called Parade, who was off to interview Kissinger. And if it makes you want to go puke somewhere, I'm sorry, but this person was coming to talk to Henry Kissinger about his sex life and to get some gossip, because that's the kind of magazine that Parade was. And so he meets Kissinger. Kissinger says, I've learned more from Dan Ellsberg than from any other person. Ellsberg believed Kissinger would say Vietnam, and that he learned about bargaining from, or that he learned some things from Daniel Ellsberg about the Vietnam War that were important. Well, Kissinger said, I learned about bargaining. That did not make a whole lot of sense to Ellsberg until he remembered the talks that he gave to Kissinger's seminar at Harvard in 1959. They were part of a lecture series called The Art of Coercion. Since that was 11 years ago, Ellsberg responded, "You have a very good memory." With a guttural draw, Kissinger added, "They were very good lectures." Nice, except that when I thought about it later, it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, Ellsberg wrote in his memoir. The lectures I had given to his class had to do with Hitler's blackmail of Austria and Czechoslovakia in the late 30s that had allowed him to take over those countries just by threatening their destruction. One of the talks was titled, quote, Theory and Practice of Blackmail, and the other was, quote, The Political Use of Madness. Hitler had deliberately cultivated among his adversaries the impression of his own irrational unpredictability. Ellsberg continues, he couldn't be counted on not to carry out a threat to do something crazy and mutually destructive. It worked for him up to a point because he was crazy, madly aggressive, and reckless. But after a certain point, it brought the world down around him. It wasn't a tactic I was recommending for the United States or anyone else for that matter, far from it. For someone to imitate Hitler in this respect was to cultivate madness and court disaster. And yet, that is exactly what Henry Kissinger was doing, because the US under Nixon had invaded Cambodia in April, and Ellsberg connected this compliment to leaks from unnamed Nixon officials who claimed that a major motive for the invasion was to convince the Soviets, the Chinese, and the North Vietnamese that U.S. decision-making at the highest levels was unpredictable, and that since we could do something so evidently erratic and crazy as to invade Cambodia at this stage of the war, they could not count on our reasonableness or prudence in the crisis. It was chilling to realize that the memory of Hitler's tactic as such was in the mind of the top White House advisor 3 months after Cambodia. So there you go. You want to peel back the curtain and know what it was like to be in the same airspace as Henry Kissinger. This was the ugliness. This is the ugliness of Henry Kissinger. This work doesn't stop with Dan. Dan's not the only person that can be a supporter of whistleblowers and who can actually stand up to the war machine. All of us can choose to be like Daniel Ellsberg if we want to do that. Some of us are in better positions to be influential, but we all do what we can in some small way, and that's all we really can do.
Unless there is more moral courage in the press and in Congress and in the military than we've seen in the past, I don't think we'll survive the consequences of climate change or avoiding nuclear war. So everything depends on it. Is even a small chance, which is all I faced, or said Snowden, a small chance of affecting, this ripping apart of the Constitution in Snowden's case, or of ending a war and avoiding a war's worth of lives at stake. Of course, it's worth any personal cost to consider, and to do it. Actually, you're willing to do it, and it is. We have only a small chance, but everything is at stake. It's worth pursuing it.